Hi. So for this video lecture, we're going to focus on the 4 other articles for week 2. We have the article on All Look Same by Lisa Nakamura. We have the review of the immigrant rights movement on the web by Sasha Costanza-Chock. We have the piece on advertising by Jillian Baez, and we have the article on Secret Asian Man by Tasha Oren. So a lot of this will look familiar to you. We're going to be talking about this relationship. We're going to be talking about methods. We're going to be talking again about subjectivity versus subjectlessness. We're going to be introducing new terms, tropicalization and Orientalism. And first of all, we're going to differentiate between these different uses of culture. Okay. So this is largely in response to what I've seen of your writing thus far, which is all very good. So, as you recall from last week, when talking about the term culture, there's this interplay between talking about culture as the sort of best of the values and the productions and the understandings of self that constitute culture, right? Culture in terms of the literary canons and the great films. We also have culture in terms of ways of life. Just the conduct of everyday life, what people do, that is constituting culture, customs and traditions and norms. And thirdly, we have that definition of culture in terms of the specific texts, objects, and practices that bring meaning to what it means to participate in a particular kind of community. So those are the 3 that we went over that last week. As I went over your writing on the discussion board, I want to talk about 3 different other meanings of culture that I want to carefully differentiate between, and I want you to be precise in talking about the differences in your use of the term culture. So I put culture here in quotation marks because a lot of this is related to the way that we throw the term about, not just in popular culture, but also in academic discussions. So I want to be sure that there's careful precision. On the one hand, there's culture in terms of multiculturalism, right? We all belong to multiple communities and cultures and identities. Even if you understand yourself as just the average person, I mean, there are things about you that link you to larger formations of meaning and personhood. We're not just talking here about ethnicity. We're also talking, for example, about all the things that constitute who you are and where you're from. Social identities that you may have, occupations that you may hold that you find meaningful, your relationship to your family in terms of talking about yourself as a brother or a sister. These all represent the particular cultures of multiculturalism. There's also culture in terms of meaning making. So when, for example, when I use the term culture in this course, I'm not talking about specific little cultures. I'm talking about, for example, our relationship to larger norms, standards, and values that define what it means to talk about mainstream culture, for example. Culture as this complicated process of meaning making, which is never so straightforward as the term suggests. And thirdly, and this is the one I really want to caution you against, there's talking about culture as a substitution for identity, where everything becomes a particular kind of culture. The difference between the cultures of multiculturalism and the bad use of the term culture that I don't want you to use is that the cultures of multiculturalism have actual identifiable substance, which is why oftentimes when talking about multiculturalism and diversity, we're looking at ethnic difference, because there's a particular set of things that give it meaning. Not everything is a culture. So for example, if we're talking about specific things that are racist, I find it highly inaccurate to say that there is a culture of racism, except if we're talking about particular sets of meaning making. There is nothing that is specific to a particular culture about racism. So try to avoid using it as a substitute for the term identity. Right, so culture as meaning making, culture as discrete defined sets of things. Do not use it in turn as a substitution for what you really want to say. There is nothing anchored to one culture about racism, sexism, heteronormativity, classism, or xenophobia that can be reduced to a culture. So, what you get over the sampling of the 4 primary text articles, the 4 secondary texts for this week, are these different methods that we'll use in terms of talking about popular culture. but also in terms of American studies as a field. On the one hand, there's discourse analysis. On the other hand, there's ethnography. Discourse analysis. So we can understand discourse analysis as, like it says, analyzing particular discourses. So when we're talking about a discourse in this class, we're talking about a collection of what is said and what can be said on a particular subject. So we can understand, for example, the discourse around womanhood. If we're talking about femininity, if we're talking about things that are consumed that are associated with women, if we're talking about what we think womanhood looks like, those all participate in this discourse on femininity and womanhood. So to do a discourse analysis of it, on the one hand, there's this sort of broad strokes approach where you collect together multiple different texts, objects, and practices that all speak to this larger discourse in order to find out what exactly it is and how it works and the sort of ideological function it performs. There's also discourse analysis in a second sense, which is the one that's really important for your primary text journals. If we're talking about discourse analysis in this sense, we're then talking about particular units of discourse. So for example, doing a close reading of a comic strip and then understanding how it participates in larger discourses. That would be this sort of unit-based discourse analysis. Then we can also talk about ethnography. There'll be three key ethnographic methods that appear over the course of this class. On the one hand, there's one-to-one interviews. Secondly, there's focus group interviews, which we see in the Jillian Baez article. And thirdly, there's site observation and participant observation, where you as the researcher actually go and record the types of social interactions and the sorts of interactions with the cultural space that take place that produce meaning. So, two large methods kind of filtering down into 5 specific methods. These will all be really important as we look at the different forms of production and consumption that constitute Asian Pacific American and US Latino popular cultures. All right, so then to go over the readings in broad strokes. We can understand all 4 of them as being very interested in how the visual image participates in this relationship between capital, politics, affect, and aesthetic. So with the article on responses to advertising, we can see pretty clearly how this all works together. On the one hand, we're talking about politics. We're talking about the specific works of racism and sexism that make these images so disagreeable to the viewers. We can understand in terms of capital. I mean, these are first and foremost trying to sell a product, but we shouldn't dismiss it just because of that, because there are important modes of meaning making happening through the communication of the image. That's where affect comes in, talking about what makes it appealing, what makes you want to buy the product, what is it about the image that compels you and sends specific messages that create pleasure or disgust or discomfort or happiness or yearning or desire. And then we get to the issue of the aesthetic. For example, thinking about number 1, what the image looks like, but then also number 2, what identity looks like in relationship to that, how things ought to be represented, what a stereotype looks like. Notice that all of these in talking about the image are about this mode of perception and the cultural meanings that filter through it. We can also see this relationship in talking about the comic strip and its relationship to this other cultural production, Better Luck Tomorrow, which you can write about for your primary text journal. One thing that we don't focus on in this class is popular film because I find it too difficult to separate out kind of like pop movies from cultural cinema. So on the one hand, we got politics, talking about the specific aspects of Asian Pacific American subjectivity that can help us think of ways to better coexist, right? Addressing racism head on, but then also thinking about identity and culture in these quotation marks, as important aspects of what constitutes the experience of race or pan-ethnicity.